Hello, I'm here with D'Maris Coffman, who is the director for the Center for Financial History at Cambridge University. D'Maris, thanks for agreeing to be interviewed by us today. Maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about the center.
Of course. The Center for Financial History is actually one of 7 constituent centers of Cambridge Finance, which is made possible by the Cambridge Endowment for Research in Finance. And Bill and Wesley Janeway, who've also contributed to INET, contributed to Cambridge Finance and made it possible to establish a network of cross-disciplinary centers. The Center for Financial History, I think, is somewhat unusual in that we do kind of new financial history, in that there are half a dozen ex-markets refugees of one description or another who've come to Cambridge to do financial history.
Recovering financial market practitioners, as we call them. Yeah.
Indeed. And they bring a very interesting perspective in the sense that we have someone who traded senior debt for JP Morgan, who's working on monetary policy. We have somebody who started as a commodities broker who then went to work for Westface Capital in Canada, who is working on North American commodities markets in the interwar period. We have a former insurance journalist who's working on the history of maritime or marine insurance. And the consequence of that is that you get a lot of finely detailed microstructure studies that you wouldn't get from people who aren't familiar with the instruments and the markets that they're investigating. So we like to think that it's really reinvigorating financial history and letting us look more closely at questions that people had assumed had been settled 20 years ago.
Right, and so I know you also had a background in the markets before you.
Well, not trading, but
but you were
yeah.
exactly. But you now consider yourself to be a historian.
I do.
A much more respectable profession, a lot of us would say. Now, what do you think historians actually can contribute to new economic thinking?
I think historians can contribute essentially in 3 ways, and that is that, as many suggested yesterday during the plenary session over dinner, that historians bring a perspective that is enhanced by or complements development studies, because very frequently we think, and policymakers think, of emerging markets in terms of historical parallels. So by investigating these historical parallels much more closely, we can begin to reveal why some of these assumptions are fallacious. So that's certainly one thing that historians can do, and I think we've done that recently with respect to this credible commitment thesis that is very often floated as a model for how developing countries should manage their bond markets. But more than that, historians also can provide a history of economic thinking, both economic analysis and economic thought, and for that matter, a history of economists that can demonstrate the path dependence and the hysteresis of not only the institutions but also the ideas that have brought us to this particular juncture. And I think the third thing that historians can do, and this picks up on what David Tuckett was saying about narrative and the power of narrative to frame asset price bubbles, is to think in terms of not only explanation in the way that economists in an econometric sense explain things, but also narrative interpretation. And sometimes the narrative interpretation is much more influential in forming other people's expectations and can illuminate a lot that the economic models can't necessarily reveal.
Yes, there was that Nigerian author who recently died, I think, who said something about the idea that lions don't write history, so that's why he decided to become a writer. So
yeah, well, that's certainly true. In fact, the founding contributors of our center said that success explains itself, narrative explains failure, and I think that's suggesting something very similar.
In fact, if we talk about who's recounted the history, one of the most fascinating things that I found over the course of the crisis from 2008 onwards was that what started as a private debt bubble, certainly in the US, gradually evolved into a narrative of public profligacy. That was the story in Europe. And in the US, it had another interesting twist, which was that it became a story of greedy public sector unions. All of a sudden, the depredations of Wall Street didn't matter, but public sector unions were somehow responsible for the mess we were in right now.
Well, that's certainly very interesting in terms of the way the U.S. discourse is emerged in the 20 years after the end of the Cold War. That there is a sense on some members of the American political right that the consequence of the United States winning the Cold War in inverted commas is that everything that is not a defense of free market capitalism is necessarily a betrayal of the founding fathers, and I think that's ringing rather hollow these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, speaking of ringing rather hollow, there's been, it's been a fairly colourful conference. What would you, as a historian, say was the most controversial claim you've heard since you've been here?
Well, I think last night's plenary was fascinating in that way because there was this very interesting exchange between Ferguson and Turner about the nature of the 18th century and how so far credible commitment, the argument advanced by North and Weingast in 1989, this idea that institutions certainly matter, but for them that they matter in a particular sense, that what the British achieved with the Glorious Revolution ushered in good governance, protection of private property rights, the rule of law, and as a consequence made it possible for the British to borrow at almost half the rate of the French, and as a consequence obtain military and eventually commercial supremacy in the 18th century, which has been advanced as a development model for the rest of the world, the so-called Washington Consensus. You could see Ferguson was defending that as if it had not been questioned empirically, as if there weren't alternatives. On the other hand, Lord Turner and also Dr. Janeway himself in his opening comments are pointing out that if really the 18th century Britain was an oligarchy with remarkably bad institutions, so much so that they actually offended the American colonists enough to start a revolution, and that in fact the Industrial Revolution succeeded not because of, but rather in spite of 18th century British institutions. And that really does actually fit very nicely with something that the Center for Financial History has done with our inaugural conference in 2010 on questioning credible commitment and actually looking at what really did happen and what lessons can we really learn from this, rather than this rather glib rehashing of the Whig history of the Glorious Revolution. And what we discovered were really three things that were very important. One is this notion of political stability. The political risk is the biggest determinant of sovereign borrowing, and I think we can see that in the Eurozone crisis, that it's actually people on the street, and it's the response to austerity measures that have kids in Greece throwing pipe bombs under trucks that cause the spreads to widen. It's not this question of the profligacy of the public sector or the perception that unions are insisting on wage increases or any of that sort of thing that was advanced even 5 years ago as an ironclad notion of what would trigger bond vigilantism. The next thing, and which I think is equally important, is this notion that actually in politics what matters is the willingness of one party to honor the other party's commitments. So the turning point was actually not 1688-89, but 1710, when the Tory politicians said, okay, the Whigs have grossly, have essentially engendered a public debt crisis, but we're not going to renege on their commitments. We're not going to default. We're going to honor the commitments of our predecessor. And in a parliamentary democracy, that's very, very important. And you also see, in terms of the United States, which is not a parliamentary democracy, but a republic, that gridlock in Washington that was so toxic last year, when it seemed possible that the U.S. wouldn't raise the debt ceiling. The real lesson of the 18th century is that that's the worst sort of politics possible in terms of setting a good example in sovereign debt markets. And then I think the third thing really is that the fiscal apparatus of the 18th century British state, which was nothing if not coercive, nothing if not arbitrary, and nothing if not dismissive of popular property rights, although, as Lord Turner pointed out, it respected elite property rights, was able to extract up to 40% of the economy in commodity taxation. That's what paid for that's what provided the revenue stream to carry the debt load that made Britain into the power that it was in the 18th century. So it was not about good governance, certainly not about protection of property rights in the way that laissez-faire fundamentalists like to believe, and it was not about the common law, nor was it about this notion that Parliament had wrestled control from a predatory monarch. Quite the contrary, it was about other things entirely, and close investigations of market microstructure, close investigations of financial history done by people who know something about these markets does change the way, and could potentially change the way we think about these historical analogies that are thrown around all the time.
And one of the historic analogies or rules that we allegedly learned from history, which used to drive me crazy, is the Rogoff Reinhardt book, the famous 90% debt to GDP ratio, after public debt to GDP ratio, and after which bad things that supposedly happen. And this was, supposedly gave us 800 years of solid financial history, and I thought it was rife with historic error. There was no distinction in many instances, between private and public debt. There was no distinction between different kinds of systems. I would think, as a historian, you had some real issues with it as well.
Well, actually, what's really astonishing about that is Routledge came to us, came to me, came to Larry Neal, and came to one of the young scholars, Adrian Leonard, who's a PhD student of mine, to commission a 4-volume work on the history of financial crises that would essentially refute that. So there is an awareness even on the part of publishers that although the Princeton book was enormously successful, that it is rife with error, and that we need to demonstrate that as a community, financial historians, economic historians, particularly the sort of macroeconomic history that the Barry Eichengreen does, has produced the empirical data to destroy the Reinhardt and Rogoff thesis. Because it is the sort of thing that sells books. It's a very simple, simplistic.
Sells books, and it's on Fox News, cited as the Bible all the time. Although I was once on the program, one of the programs, and pointed out that on the threshold of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, their public debt to GDP ratio was over 200%. It didn't seem to stop them from experiencing one of the greatest.
Well, indeed. Not only was the debt to GDP ratio over 200%, but also the British state captured 70% of the commodity output of the country in the form of indirect taxation. So you're talking about debt loads. And for that matter, fiscal extraction on a scale that people haven't contemplated in the West for quite some time. Yet, as you say, this was the greatest period of economic or commercial expansion in Britain.
You've also looked at, shall we say, non-traditional economic areas. For example, I know in your work you've cited climate change and food security as two critical issues. And you've done work in comparing that to the corn returns project. So how does that speak to the two issues?
Well, the interesting thing is it relates directly, because the key to the ability of the British state in the 18th century to borrow was its ability to tax. And commodity taxation really turned on excisable liquors, and excisable liquors, which are just say beer and ale, consumed 50% of the grain trade of Britain in the 18th century, and really that was a source of about a quarter of the revenue stream. So the British state in the 18th century got very interested in monitoring the grain trade and was collecting price and quantity data from corn markets, not corn in the sense of maize corn, but corn in the sense of wheat, rye, barley, oats, and peas, and they monitored these markets very, very closely. As for that matter, did other continental powers. The French were also obsessed with the grain trade. But the data that we can extract from the efforts of the 18th century to understand their own economy, in the 19th century as well, can help us understand how Britain escaped the Malthusian trap. Because what's remarkable is that when Adam Smith was writing 1776, the population of Britain was really somewhere between 7.5 and 8 million. By 1848, it was 22 million. So, and that kind of expansion in the space of 2 generations is something very similar to what the developing world is facing today in terms of rapid growth of population. Yet, despite the predictions of the political economists in the 1820s, Britain did avoid the Malthusian trap. And those of us who are essentially optimistic about the 21st century's ability to do the same thing need to understand why 19th century Britain was able to do so, particularly because we know that the answer is not because they had better institutions. Because if anything, the institutions in that period were frankly fairly appalling.
It's pretty hopeful, actually, because you look today and looking around our political landscape with all the dysfunction, they seem similarly appalling, and yet I guess that period does give us some hope that things can get a little bit better.
Well, yeah, no, indeed, and I think to come back to this question yesterday of institutions matter, they certainly do, and I think we all agree that countries that are not doing particularly well economically tend to have bad institutions, but it's not been demonstrated that the relationship is consistent and that the direction of causality is consistent, because up to a point, sure, institutions that are too bad are going to retard growth. But on the other hand, if they're good enough institutions, then you get to a point where the reason the institutions are good is because the economy is good, rather than the economy being good because the institutions are. So I think at some point, the direction of causality shifts, and that many of the countries that appear to have model institutions simply because they can afford them. Yet, it may not be how, but having good enough institutions is the key thing, not having sterling ones.
And on that relatively optimistic note, I think we'll stop it here. But again, thank you very much for coming and sharing your insights. They'll be appreciated by everyone.
Thank you, Marshall.